So the New York Times is now, again, another conspiracy theory turns out to be 100% true. After relentlessly calling it a conspiracy theory, the New York Times and the CDC now admit authorities overcounted COVID deaths and overhyped the pandemic. About a third of official COVID deaths, or hundreds of thousands of deaths, were not due to COVID. So, hey, a positive COVID milestone. Is it that you're going to stop lying about COVID deaths? Is that the COVID milestone? Well, I guess that's positive. You know what? It's also a milestone. So great job, New York Times. In a sign that the pandemic really is over, the total number of Americans dying each day is no longer historically abnormal.
That's weird. What about the temperatures?
So the United States has reached a milestone in the long struggle against COVID. The total number of Americans dying each day from any cause is no longer historically abnormal. Excess deaths, as this number is known, has been an important measure of COVID's true toll because it does not depend on the murky attribution of deaths to a specific cause. However, a level of phony propaganda reporting will remain at an abnormally high level.
Wait. I have a question.
So let me just explain to you what So I think they're lying about excess deaths here because excess deaths mean, so they know how many people are supposed to die each week normally. So they take the numbers from the 5 years in front of the pandemic and then they compare it to the numbers of people dying since the pandemic started. And there's all these excess deaths, except there's all these excess deaths that cannot be attributed to COVID. So what they're implying in this is that these excess deaths were all from COVID, and now we're getting back to normal levels. But those excess deaths weren't from COVID. There's a lot of excess deaths that they say aren't from COVID. So they're misleading you here. That's one way I just found out. What was your question, Kurt?
Okay, I don't understand. It says it does not depend on the murky attribution of deaths to a specific cause. How would attributing deaths to a specific cause be
murky?
Yeah,
because they were lying about it. So
okay,
they were.
Okay,
that's why. Yeah. So like if you came in with a gunshot wound and they would say that
I went in blind and it was from ivermectin.
Yeah. Even if COVID is being underdiagnosed, the excess death statistics can capture its effects. The statistic also captures COVID's indirect effects, like the surge of vehicle crashes, gun deaths, and deaths from missed medical treatments during the pandemic. Okay. During COVID's worst phases, the total number of Americans dying each day was more than 30% higher than normal, a shocking increase. For long stretches of but they're not all due to COVID. For long stretches of the past 3 years, the excess death was above 10%, but during the past few months, excess deaths have fallen. And also, and this is just a coincidence, people stopped taking the vaccines. Nobody's taking the booster.
Hey, guys, get out there.
And so these two think that has nothing to do with this.
If you want
That's just a coincidence, Kurt.
A vaccine a day keeps the doctor.
So they're not telling you this, that you can't attribute those excess deaths to COVID. There's all these excess deaths that are not attributed to COVID, and they're not telling you that in this. They're making you believe that all the excess deaths were from COVID, and now COVID's over pretty much, and so the excess deaths are going back down. They're not talking about any coincidence of that people stopped taking the vaccines. They're not talking about that because it doesn't have anything to do with it.
Or lockdowns ending with the height of all the bad things in the world.
But during the past few months, excess deaths have fallen almost to zero, according to 3 different measures. Okay. The Human Mortality Database estimates that slightly fewer Americans than normal have died since March, while The Economist magazine and the CDC both put the excess death number below 1%. COVID's toll, to be clear, has not fallen to zero. The CDC's main COVID webpage estimates that 80 people per day have been dying from the virus in recent weeks, which is equal to about 1% of overall daily deaths. The official number is probably an exaggeration because it includes some people who had virus when they died, even though it was not the underlying cause of death. Other CDC data suggests that almost 1/3 of official recent COVID deaths have fallen into this category. Into the category of they didn't actually die from COVID. The CDC is admitting. The number is probably an exaggeration. Of course, so they're admitting they overcounted COVID deaths. That's the important thing here. And they're still lying. And it appears that they're misrepresenting the excess death data.
Hey, let's let bygones be bygones and all forgive each other over a nice round of vaccines.
So, a study published in the journal Clinical Infectious Diseases came to similar conclusions. The similar conclusion that they were overcounting COVID deaths. Whoa! What is this? The New York Times or the latest copy of No Shit magazine? Turns out they were overcounting the COVID deaths, Kurt. Who could have told you that except pothead comedians drunk and asleep? But now they finally figured it out in end of July 2023 over at the New York Times. They finally figured out they were overcounting COVID deaths, and they're admitting to like 1/3. So probably 2/3 or so probably most of them, because they're all liars at the CDC and the New York Times. They've lied to you since the beginning of this. Do you think they've stopped lying? This is what they're admitting to. They're admitting to 1/3 of the COVID deaths were overcounted to scare the hell out of you.
Exaggerated, we'll call it.
Wow. Our most reliable pandemic number is losing meaning. That's from September 2021. A new study suggests that almost half of those hospitalized with COVID-19 have mild or asymptomatic cases. Oh my God, we can't scare the hell out. So most of the people who had to go to the hospital for COVID had mild symptoms. Almost half, not most. Strike that. Almost half. Jesus H. Who could have possibly predicted, Kurt? What human psychic anomaly with powers beyond all space and time could have ever predicted that your most reliable COVID numbers would turn out to be total shit? Wow! David Sweet knows. If you want to make sense of the number of COVID hospitalizations at any given time, you need to know how sick each patient actually is. Until now, that's been almost impossible to suss out.
Has it?
Some patients need extensive medical intervention, such as getting intubated. Turns out that Fauci said that they shouldn't have done that now. Others require supplemental oxygen or administration of steroid dexamethasone. But there are many COVID patients in the hospital with fairly mild symptoms who have been admitted for further observations on account of their comorbidities or because they reported feeling short of breath. Another portion of the patients in this tally are in the hospital for something unrelated to COVID and discovered that they were infected only because they were tested upon admission. How many patients fall into each category has been a topic of much speculation. For two separate studies published in May 2021, doctors in California read through several hundred charts of pediatric patients one by one to figure out why exactly each COVID-positive child had been admitted to the hospital. Did they need treatment for COVID, or was there some other reason for admission, like cancer treatment or a psychiatric episode, and the COVID diagnosis was merely incidental? According to the researchers, 40 to 45% of the hospitalizations that they examined were for patients in the latter group, meaning it was just incidental, that they weren't in the hospital for COVID. So again, almost half of all pediatrician kids who were admitted to hospitals for COVID didn't have COVID, that weren't there because of COVID. They were reported by the government and the news media that they were there for COVID, but it turns out they weren't.
Well, did they at least get it at the hospital?
COVID? I hope so.
It was a big waste if they didn't.
Wow, where did these researchers get their research? My show? In August, researchers from Harvard Medical School, Tufts Medical Center, and Veterans Affairs Healthcare Systems analyzed the electronic records for nearly 50,000 COVID hospital admissions at more than 100 VA hospitals across the country. They then checked to see whether each patient required supplemental oxygen or had the blood oxygen level before 94%. That latter criterion is based on the National Institutes of COVID definition of severe COVID. If either of these conditions was met, the authors classified that patient as having moderate to severe COVID. Otherwise, the case was considered mild or asymptomatic. Well, the study found that from March 2020 to January 2021, before vaccination was widespread and before Delta variant had arrived, the proportion of patients with mild or asymptomatic disease was 36%. It's over a third. From mid-January through the end of June 2021, however, that number rose to 48%. In other words, the study suggests that roughly half of all the hospitalized patients showing up on COVID data dashboards in 2021 may have been admitted for another reason entirely, or had only a mild presentation of a disease. Wow, Kurt, they just discovered the thing that we knew 3 frickin' years ago.
That Bill Gates knew 2 years ago.
I didn't know that during the pandemic, even researchers didn't do their own research. Isn't that something?
I suspected.
So this study suggests that COVID hospitalization tallies can be taken as a simple... Can't be taken as a simple measure of prevalence of severe or even moderate COVID disease, because they might inflate the true numbers by a factor of 2.
Well, okay, I know we already knew this, but this is the time when we finally break it to the readers of The Atlantic.
But you know what, though, right?
These are the people, they have to hear it this way.
But actually, Kurt, this article is from September, from 2021. So this was in The Atlantic in September 2021, but apparently nobody read it, and nobody
lost his job.
He probably lost his job. We should follow up on David Zweig, see how he's doing.
I hope they ran him right out of the business.
I bet he got run out of the business because he said something true about COVID. So now the New York Times just caught up to The Atlantic is what's happening. And they just caught up to the Jimmy Dore show. So let's watch this.
So I think in this country, we've taken a very liberal...
Whoa. That's quite a... What's up going on? Hang on a minute. Is she doing an impression of somebody? Did she really talk like that? Let's listen.
Do you think the scarf...
So I think in this country, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. There are other...
Is that... What's my favorite Minneapolis comedian's name? What's her name?
Maria Bamford.
Is that Maria Bamford doing a character? Because that's what it sounds like.
It does sound like Maria.
Tell me if... Close your eyes and tell me if you don't think this is Maria Bamford doing a character.
So I think in this country, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. There are other...
If you know who Maria Bamford is, that is unbelievable. Okay, here we go. So let's start it again.
So I think in this country, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. There are other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem, some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
Can you be sure? You hear from coroners that that's not necessarily the case. Or are you sure? How can you be confident about that? And is there any concern that it skews?
Wow. New York Times, did they just see this video?
She just walks away. Okay, not gonna. But the corners say this is wrong.
They cut back. It's gone.
Do you remember this, Kurt? This is my favorite one. This is from my home state, Illinois.
I just want to be clear in terms of the definition of people dying of COVID. So the case definition is very simplistic. It means at the time of death, it was a COVID positive diagnosis. So that means that if you were in hospice and had already been given, a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means that even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that that was the cause of the death, but they had COVID at the time of death. I hope that's helpful.
They
always run away.
Just like the Looney Tunes music.
So what did you want to say? But
I can't remember. I'm so blown away by the same. So they've been openly saying this, which I do remember, which I'm so blown away that researchers had to. What did they did a study of 2 clips, and then they run. That's my favorite part.
So we've reported this. There's that. By the way, that last clip we played of the lady from Illinois, this lady,
Maria Bamford.
This lady, they Reuterized it.
Whoa!
They did a fact check that said that doesn't mean what it says. I swear to God, I saw it.
I thought they said she didn't leave that fast.
No,
that was not a real noise.
I really want to hear this lady again.
So I think in this country we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. There are other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem. Some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it. And the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
Can you be sure? You hear from coroners that that's not necessarily the case. Are you sure? How can you be so confident about that? And is there any concern that it skews?
Wait, I missed that where she's like, did she just say we market that? Did I hear the word market?
I don't know if I heard that. I wouldn't doubt it. I didn't hear it, but
you're just waiting for the most beautiful moment, the most beautiful timing. So that could have been a great Maria bit. So now that New York Times, Kurt, is admitting that they overcounted the COVID deaths. After relentlessly calling it a conspiracy theory, I'm sure now that our friends are going to admit that they were wrong about COVID. My friends don't know nothing about nothing, so or they just remain the same. Or are they going to say the New York Times is a conspiracy theorist now? Is that what they're going to do? I thought maybe that, but I think if the New York Times is coming out and saying it, that's going to be the official thing. You would think. All going to, because the way they're selling that is like, oh yeah, so it's counting on a lot. Like one, no one's going to read it, right? And then, but the Atlantic, when the Atlantic comes in, well, that was 2021. I forgot. Yeah. Well, anyway, there you go. You were lied to from start to finish about COVID. Hope you, and shame on you for shaming people who were skeptical and asked questions like you're supposed to. Come see our live shows. We're going to be in Chicago, Rosemont, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, New York City, Pottstown, Pennsylvania, Stamford, Toronto, Toledo, Detroit, St. Louis, and more. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for those tickets.